When Wanda Jean Allen walked into Oklahoma's death chamber on January 11, 2001, she made history twice over, becoming both the first black woman and the first openly gay woman to be executed in the United States since 1954. Her final words, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do," echoed through a system that would go on to execute several more black women in the decades that followed, each case illuminating the complex intersection of race, gender, and justice in America's death penalty debate.
I had a lot of support. I had my first child early. My parents were very disappointed in me, but they said, okay, this happened, don't make the mistake again, you know, and they encouraged me to continue being a teenager because I was a teenager.
Frances Elaine Newton, State of Texas. On April 7, 1987, 21-year-old Frances Newton committed a crime that would make her the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. The victims were her husband, Adrian, 23, their son, Alton, 7, and their daughter, Farah, 21 months old. The case began when Newton took out life insurance policies worth $100,000 on her husband and daughter, just weeks before their deaths. She told investigators she had left their apartment to run errands and return to find her family dead from gunshot wounds. However, the prosecution's evidence would paint a different picture. Investigators discovered that Newton had purchased a .25 caliber pistol 3 weeks before the killings. The weapon was later found at an abandoned house where Newton's cousin lived. Ballistics tests matched it to the bullets that killed her family. Additionally, authorities found gunshot residue on the dress Newton was wearing the night of the murders. During her trial, prosecutors argued that Newton's motive was financial gain from the insurance policies. They presented evidence of her difficult financial situation and troubled marriage. Newton maintained her innocence throughout, claiming her husband was involved in drugs and suggesting he may have been killed by dealers. Her case gained attention from civil rights activists who pointed to concerns about racial bias in the Texas justice system. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund highlighted irregularities in her case, including questions about the handling of evidence and the adequacy of her legal representation. Her attorneys argued that the gun residue testing was flawed and that important evidence had been destroyed before it could be tested by the defense. Despite multiple appeals and claims of inadequate legal representation, Newton was executed by lethal injection on September 14, 2005, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. For her last meal, she declined any special requests and was served the standard prison meal of chicken, corn, green beans, and sliced bread. Her final words were filled with religious conviction. "I love my family. I'm going to be with Jesus. I love all of you. I will see you when you get there. I will talk to you sooner or later." She was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m., becoming the third black woman executed in the United States since 1976. Newton's case highlighted ongoing concerns about racial disparities in capital punishment. Civil rights organizations noted that black defendants, particularly black women, often faced additional challenges in capital cases, including limited access to resources for their defense and potential racial bias in jury selection and sentencing.
Let's do our prayers. Oh, very nice handwriting. You want to put it over here in this corner? You want to put it over here? I can sit over here for you.
Dear Lord, give Wanda Jean Allen the words to say, the words that you want her to say. Help her to be herself. She is someone we want to know, we want to care about, we want to save. In Christ's name we pray.
Yeah, we're on 3.
By the way, can you praise the
sliding
Lord?
path.
Wanda Jean Allen, State of Oklahoma. In December 1988, a case emerged in Oklahoma City that would lead to a historic execution. Wanda Jean Allen, age 29 at the time, became involved in a fatal confrontation with her partner, Gloria Leathers, outside a police station. This case would ultimately make Allen the first black woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty. The relationship between Allen and Leathers had been marked by volatility. They had met at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center while Allen was serving time for manslaughter. She had previously been convicted of killing another girlfriend, Deetra Pettis, in 1981. After their release, Allen and Leathers lived together for 2 years before their relationship began to deteriorate. On December 1, 1988, Leathers had decided to leave Allen and was moving her belongings out of their shared home. The two women had a heated argument that led them to the village police department, where Leathers was attempting to file a complaint. As Leathers left the police station with her mother, Allen confronted her in the parking lot. Witnesses reported that Allen produced a .38 caliber pistol and shot Leathers in the abdomen. Gloria Leathers died 3 days later. During the trial, prosecutors portrayed Allen as the aggressor who had deliberately pursued and killed Leathers. They emphasized her previous manslaughter conviction and argued that the shooting was premeditated. The prosecution noted that Allen had gone home to retrieve the gun before following Leathers to the police station. Allen's defense team, however, faced significant challenges in presenting mitigating evidence. Critical information about Allen's intellectual disabilities was not effectively presented to the jury. Later, appeals would reveal that Allen had an IQ of only 69 and had been diagnosed with brain damage. Her mental health history and traumatic background were also not fully explored during her initial trial. The jury found Allen guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death. Her case gained international attention as her execution date approached, with advocates arguing that her intellectual disabilities should have made her ineligible for capital punishment. The National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty highlighted her case as an example of the intersection of racial bias, mental health issues, and capital punishment. Civil rights organizations and mental health advocates mounted an intensive campaign for clemency. Even Reverend Jesse Jackson became involved, meeting with Allen and speaking out against her scheduled execution. However, despite these efforts and multiple appeals, including pleas to the U.S. Supreme Court, Allen's execution moved forward. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. For her last meal, she requested a bag of chips, a date-filled cookie, and a lemon-lime soda. Her final words reflected both remorse and religious faith. "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I love everybody. God bless you all. I'm going to a better place." Allen's case brought attention to several critical issues in capital punishment, including the treatment of defendants with intellectual disabilities, the role of mental health evidence in capital cases, and the intersectionality of race, gender, and sexuality in the criminal justice system. Her execution sparked renewed debate about these issues and contributed to ongoing discussions about reform in capital cases. Lena Baker, State of Georgia. In the pre-dawn hours of April 30, 1944, a confrontation between a black housekeeper and her white employer in rural Cuthbert, Georgia, would lead to a case that epitomized the racial injustice of capital punishment in the Jim Crow South. Lena Baker, aged 44, became the only woman executed by electrocution in Georgia's history, in a case that would later result in a posthumous pardon. Baker worked for Ernest Knight, a local grist mill operator who had hired her as a housekeeper. Knight, who walked with a cane due to a broken leg, had developed an inappropriate relationship with Baker, often forcing her to stay at his mill for days at a time. According to court records and Baker's testimony, he regularly threatened her with violence if she tried to leave his employment. On that fateful morning, Knight had locked Baker in his mill overnight. When she attempted to leave, a struggle ensued. During the confrontation, Baker managed to gain control of Knight's gun. She later testified that Knight had threatened to shoot her if she tried to quit him, and that she fired the fatal shot in self-defense when he raised his walking stick to strike her. Knight died from a single gunshot wound. The trial that followed lasted less than a day, with an all-white male jury taking just 4 hours to convict Baker of murder. Her court-appointed defense lawyer presented minimal evidence and called no witnesses except Baker herself. The jury dismissed her claims of self-defense, despite evidence of Knight's violent history and the clear power imbalance between a white employer and his black employee in 1940 Georgia. During her testimony, Baker stated plainly, "What I done in self-defense, or I would have been killed myself. Where I could not overcome it. God has forgiven me. I have nothing in my heart against anyone. I am ready to meet my God. I am ready to die." Baker was sentenced to death, and all appeals were denied. On March 5, 1945, she was executed by electric chair at the Georgia State Prison in Reidsville. For her last meal, she requested a hamburger, and she spent her final hours singing spiritual hymns. Her last words were, "What I done in self-defense. I have nothing against anyone. I am ready to meet my God." The circumstances surrounding Baker's case highlighted the intersection of racial and gender discrimination in the American justice system. As a black woman in the segregated South, she faced a justice system that afforded her virtually no chance of a fair trial. The power dynamics between white employers and black employees, particularly women, created situations where abuse was common and self-defense claims were routinely dismissed. 60 years after her execution, Baker's story gained renewed attention. Her family, led by her grandnephew Roosevelt Curry, campaigned for her exoneration. In August 2005, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles granted Baker a full and unconditional pardon, acknowledging that her execution was a grievous error and that she should have been charged with voluntary manslaughter, not murder. The pardon made Baker the first person in Georgia to receive a posthumous pardon in a capital case. The board's decision noted that she could have been charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than murder for the death of E.B. Knight. This lesser charge would have made her ineligible for the death penalty. Baker's case remains a powerful symbol of the historical intersection of racial and gender bias in capital punishment. Her story has been documented in books, articles, and documentaries, serving as a reminder of the deep-rooted inequities in the American justice system and the particular vulnerabilities faced by black women defendants in capital cases.
On March 8, 1991, Dr. Larzalier reopened his office after the lunch break. He was there along with a dental assistant and his wife, Virginia Larzalier, who worked as an office manager. While they were all at the dental office, a masked gunman came into the office.
Virginia Larzalier, State of Florida. On March 8, 1991, a shooting at Edgewater, Florida dental office would lead to a case that highlighted the complexities of racial identity and justice in capital cases. Virginia Larzalier, a black woman who had often passed as white due to her light complexion, was sentenced to death for orchestrating the murder of her husband, Dr. Norman Larzalier. According to prosecutors, Virginia had convinced her teenage son, Jason, to shoot his adoptive father with a shotgun while wearing a ninja mask. The motivation, they argued, was to collect on multiple life insurance policies worth approximately $2.1 million. The shooting occurred while Dr. Larzalier was in his dental office, where a masked assailant burst in and killed him with a single shotgun blast. During the investigation, evidence emerged of Virginia's troubled history and complex relationship with race and identity. Born to a black mother, but often perceived as white, she had navigated different racial spaces throughout her life. This aspect of her identity would later become a point of discussion in examining potential racial bias in her case. The prosecution built their case largely on circumstantial evidence and testimony from jailhouse informants. They portrayed Virginia as a manipulative woman who had orchestrated the murder for financial gain. However, her defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the state's case relied heavily on unreliable witness testimony. In a separate trial, her son Jason was acquitted of all charges, creating what many legal observers saw as an inconsistent verdict. Virginia was convicted of orchestrating a murder that her alleged co-conspirator was found not to have committed. This discrepancy would become a key point in her subsequent appeals. Virginia was sentenced to death in 1993. However, her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in 2008 after evidence emerged of prosecutorial misconduct in her original trial. The reviewing court found that prosecutors had withheld crucial evidence from the defense team.
A Texas woman is set to become the 500th convicted killer in the state to receive a lethal injection. 52-year-old Kimberly McCarthy is scheduled for execution tonight for the killing of an elderly neighbor 16 years ago in North Texas. McCarthy's attorney asked the Court of Criminal Appeals here in Austin to reconsider its refusal to block her execution. She claims the jury, which heard her case, was improperly chosen based on race.
Kimberly McCarthy, State of Texas. On July 21, 1997, a brutal murder in Lancaster, Texas, would lead to a case that would make Kimberly McCarthy the 500th person executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty. McCarthy, age 36 at the time, was charged with the murder of her 71-year-old neighbor, Dorothy Booth. McCarthy, a former nursing home therapist who struggled with crack cocaine addiction, had gone to Booth's home pretending to borrow sugar. Once inside, prosecutors said she attacked Booth with a butcher knife, stabbing her 5 times, beating her with a candelabra, and cutting off her finger to steal her diamond ring. McCarthy then pawned the ring and used Booth's credit cards to purchase crack cocaine. During her trial, prosecutors also presented evidence linking McCarthy to 2 other murders of elderly women, Maggie Harding and Jetty Lucas, both in their 80s. Like Booth, they had been stabbed and robbed. These crimes were presented as evidence of a pattern, though McCarthy was never tried for these additional murders. The racial dynamics of McCarthy's trial would later become a key point of controversy. Her attorneys argued that the prosecution had deliberately excluded black jurors, resulting in a jury of 11 whites and 1 Hispanic member. This issue of racial bias in jury selection would form a significant part of her appeals. Despite multiple appeals and stays of execution, McCarthy was executed by lethal injection on June 26, 2013. For her last meal, she received the standard prison meal of the day, as Texas had abolished special last meal requests. Her final words were, "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going. I'm going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." Carlette Parker, State of North Carolina. In July 1998, a case emerged in Wake County, North Carolina, that would add Carlette Parker to the small but significant number of black women sentenced to death in the United States. Parker, a 34-year-old home health aide, was convicted of the drowning death of 88-year-old Alice Covington, whom she had been hired to care for. According to court records, Parker had developed a pattern of financially exploiting elderly clients. Prosecutors demonstrated that she had stolen checks from Covington and other elderly patients, using the money to fund a gambling addiction. When Covington threatened to report the theft, Parker took her to Jordan Lake under the pretense of a drive, where she drowned the elderly woman. The prosecution's case was strengthened by evidence that Parker had attempted a similar crime just weeks before Covington's murder. Another elderly client had survived an attempt to drown her in a bathtub, though Parker was not charged in that incident until after the Covington murder investigation. During her trial, the prosecution presented a compelling timeline of Parker's activities on the day of the murder, including surveillance footage of her using Covington's stolen credit cards and ATM card. They also introduced evidence of her gambling activities at a local casino, showing she had lost significant amounts of money in the weeks leading up to the murder. Parker's defense team argued that she suffered from severe mental illness and gambling addiction, conditions that had never been properly treated. They presented evidence of her troubled background, including childhood trauma and ongoing psychological issues. However, the jury found her guilty and recommended the death penalty. In 2004, Parker's death sentence was overturned on appeal due to issues with jury selection and problems with her original defense representation. She was later sentenced to life in prison without parole, adding her case to the growing number of death row commutations that highlighted problems in the capital punishment system. LaTonya Taylor, State of Alabama. On August 15, 2004, LaTonya Taylor became one of the few black women sentenced to death in Alabama's history. At age 25, she was convicted of the capital murder of her 2 young children in a case that would raise significant questions about mental health treatment and racial disparities in capital cases. The prosecution presented evidence that Taylor had deliberately set fire to her family's mobile home while her children were inside. The state argued that she had committed the crime to collect on insurance policies she had recently taken out on her children's lives. The fire killed both her 4-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son. During the trial, Taylor's defense team presented evidence of her history of severe mental illness, including diagnoses of bipolar disorder and major depression. They argued that she had been experiencing a mental health crisis at the time of the fire and had not received adequate psychiatric care, despite multiple attempts to seek help through the public health system. Civil rights organizations and mental health advocates pointed to Taylor's case as an example of how the intersection of race, poverty, and mental illness often led to death sentences for black defendants who might have received different treatment under other circumstances. They noted that black women with mental health issues faced particular challenges in receiving appropriate care and consideration in the criminal justice system. The jury ultimately rejected the defense's arguments about Taylor's mental state and found her guilty. Her case has remained controversial, with advocates continuing to argue that racial bias and inadequate consideration of mental health factors influenced both her conviction and death sentence.
Stay of execution in place right now for a Kansas woman convicted in a heinous crime. Lisa Montgomery killed a woman and kidnapped her unborn baby in 2004.
Lisa Montgomery Coleman, State of Texas. In June 1995, Lisa Coleman's case would add another chapter to the complex history of black women facing capital punishment in Texas. Coleman, age 27 at the time, was convicted in the death of 9-year-old Devontai Williams, the son of her girlfriend, Marcella Williams. The prosecution presented evidence that Coleman and Williams had subjected Devontai to severe abuse and malnutrition over an extended period. Medical examiners found more than 250 distinct injuries on the child's body, who weighed just 36 pounds at the time of his death. Prosecutors argued that Coleman had been the primary abuser, with Williams failing to protect her son from the abuse. During her trial, Coleman's defense team presented evidence of her own history of childhood abuse and trauma, arguing that she had repeated patterns of violence she had experienced. They also raised questions about the distribution of culpability between Coleman and Williams, who received a life sentence in a separate trial after pleading guilty to injury to a child. The racial dynamics of Coleman's case became part of broader discussions about disparities in capital sentencing, particularly in cases involving child victims. Her attorneys argued that implicit bias may have influenced how her role in the crime was perceived compared to similar cases with defendants of different races. Despite multiple appeals, including challenges to the fairness of her trial and the adequacy of her original defense, Coleman was executed by lethal injection on September 17, 2014. For her last meal, she received the standard prison meal, as Texas had abolished special last meal requests. Her final statement expressed remorse. "I just want to tell my family I love them. My son, I love him. The girls on the row, I love them and keep their heads up. Tell them I finish strong. God is good." As of 2024, Black women represent a small but significant percentage of death row inmates in the United States. Since 1976, when the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment, approximately 2% of all death row inmates have been women, with Black women comprising about 20% of female death row populations. Several patterns emerge when examining these cases. The majority of Black women sentenced to death were convicted of crimes involving people they knew, rather than strangers. This differs from the pattern seen in cases involving male defendants, who are more often convicted of killing strangers during other crimes. Mental health issues and histories of trauma appear frequently in these cases. Many of the women had documented histories of abuse, mental illness, or intellectual disabilities that were not adequately considered during their original trials. The role of racial bias in jury selection has been a recurring issue. Multiple cases have included appeals based on the systematic exclusion of Black jurors, reflecting broader concerns about racial discrimination in the justice system. Recent years have seen an increase in successful appeals and commutations for Black women on death row. These outcomes often result from the discovery of prosecutorial misconduct, inadequate defense representation, or new evidence supporting claims of racial bias in the original proceedings. The geographic distribution of cases shows a concentration in southern states, particularly Texas and Florida, reflecting broader patterns in capital punishment. However, cases involving Black women on death row have occurred across the country, from California to North Carolina. Advocates and legal scholars have noted several systemic issues that particularly affect Black women in capital cases: limited access to adequate legal representation and resources for mounting an effective defense, implicit bias in jury selection and sentencing decisions, inadequate consideration of mitigating factors such as domestic violence and mental health issues, the intersection of racial and gender discrimination in the criminal justice system, higher rates of wrongful convictions and death sentences compared to other demographic groups. These patterns have led to increased scrutiny of how the death penalty is applied to Black women defendants, and have contributed to broader discussions about racial justice in capital punishment. Organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund have highlighted these cases as examples of ongoing systemic bias in the application of capital punishment. Erica Shepard, State of Texas. In June 1993, Erica Shepard became one of the youngest Black women sentenced to death in Texas when, at age 19, she was convicted in the murder of Marilyn Meager. Her case continues to raise important questions about youth, racial bias, and gender in capital punishment. The prosecution alleged that Shepard and James Dickerson broke into Meager's Houston apartment to steal her car. During the incident, Meager was attacked with a knife and baseball bat. Prosecutors argued that both Shepard and Dickerson participated in the attack, though Shepard maintained she was coerced by Dickerson and feared for her own life if she didn't comply. During her trial, Shepard's defense team presented evidence of her troubled background, including sexual abuse, teenage pregnancy, and domestic violence. However, many aspects of her history of trauma and its impact on her mental health were not fully explored at trial. Her case has become emblematic of how young Black women's experiences of trauma are often inadequately considered in capital cases. Shepard remains on death row, and her case continues through the appeals process. Her attorneys have raised issues about racial bias in jury selection, inadequate consideration of her youth at the time of the crime, and questions about the quality of her original legal representation. These challenges reflect broader concerns about how the justice system handles cases involving young Black women defendants. The treatment of Black women in capital cases has evolved significantly since the first modern death penalty statutes. Recent years have seen increased recognition of how racial and gender bias can intersect to create unique disadvantages for Black women defendants. Courts have begun to show greater willingness to consider evidence of systematic discrimination in jury selection, sentencing decisions, and access to adequate defense resources. Modern forensic techniques and evolving standards for scientific evidence have led to successful challenges in several cases involving Black women on death row. Defense teams have become more effective at challenging questionable forensic evidence and presenting alternative scientific explanations for prosecution evidence. This has resulted in several high-profile exonerations and sentence reductions. The role of mental health evidence has gained prominence in both trials and appeals. Courts increasingly recognize the importance of understanding trauma, particularly in cases involving Black women who have experienced abuse, poverty, and systemic discrimination. This has led to more comprehensive mental health evaluations and more effective presentation of mitigating evidence. The number of Black women on death row has declined significantly since the 1990s peak. This reduction reflects both successful appeals and a broader shift away from death sentences in many jurisdictions. The geographic distribution of cases has also changed, with fewer new death sentences being imposed in states that historically sentence the most Black women to death. Successful appeals have often centered on issues of racial bias in jury selection, inadequate defense representation, and prosecutorial misconduct. Civil rights organizations have documented patterns of discrimination in how capital cases involving Black women are prosecuted, including disparities in plea bargain offers, application of aggravating factors, and consideration of mitigating evidence. The quality of legal representation has improved through the work of organizations focused on capital defense and racial justice. These groups have developed specialized expertise in representing Black women defendants, leading to more effective trial strategies and appeal arguments. They have also worked to document and challenge systematic bias in the application of capital punishment. The future of capital punishment for Black women defendants appears to be at a crossroads. Growing awareness of racial and gender bias in the criminal justice system has led to increased scrutiny of death penalty cases. Courts are showing greater receptivity to evidence of systematic discrimination and the need for reform in how capital cases are handled. Social science research continues to illuminate how implicit bias affects every stage of capital cases, from initial charging decisions through jury selection and sentencing. This research has strengthened constitutional challenges to the death penalty and influenced how courts evaluate claims of racial discrimination. Reform efforts continue on multiple fronts, with organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund working to improve representation for Black women facing capital charges. These efforts include developing new approaches to presenting mitigating evidence, challenging discriminatory practices in jury selection, and advocating for legislative reforms to address racial disparities in capital punishment. The experiences of Black women on death row have contributed significantly to broader discussions about the future of capital punishment in America. Their cases have highlighted persistent issues of racial and gender bias, the importance of considering trauma and mental health, and the need for continued reform in how the justice system handles capital cases involving marginalized defendants. If you like the way we create these videos, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.